They told you that the night shift was harmless, just another piece of working-class drudgery, a sacrifice made so others could sleep. But what if I told you that the graveyard shift was never designed for survival? It was engineered as a curse? Listen carefully now. The hours between midnight and dawn were once feared, not scheduled. Ancient societies marked them as the watch of spirits, the time when walls between worlds thinned, when men broke fastest, when minds cracked open to whispers that weren't their own. And yet, in the factories, in the hospitals, in the prisons, you were placed there. If you have the strength to face the darkest truths, subscribe right now and press the bell icon so that no hidden story slips past you before anyone else hears it. You were given to the night, not for efficiency, for control. Think about it. Every culture throughout history warned that prolonged wakefulness in the dead hours eroded sanity, weakened the body, and left the soul vulnerable. The Romans called it the hora mortis, the hour of death, when soldiers on watch most often deserted their post or turned on their comrades. Medieval monastic orders whispered that those who worked through these hours aged faster, sickened more, and sometimes never came back from the silence. But in our modern age, industrialists, prison wardens, and government planners saw not danger, but opportunity. They learned that if you place a man in the endless cycle of midnight labor, his resistance shatters, his circadian rhythm breaks, his judgment falters, he becomes malleable, a creature easier to command than a free human ever could be. The graveyard shift was not born of necessity. It was perfected as a weapon. Do you feel it? The crawling unease that creeps into your chest when the clock slips past 2 a.m.? That heaviness in your bones isn't fatigue alone. It's the weight of centuries of manipulation pressing down on you. Because every empire, from the plantations of the Old South to the steel mills of the North, knew the same secret. If you can steal a man's night, you can steal his will. And here's the part you were never meant to know. Those who keep watch at these hours are not just employees. They are offerings. The night demands them. The system provides them. Some call it superstition. But buried in sealed medical archives, military records, and religious doctrine lies the same warning. When man labors at the witching hours, he doesn't just work for his masters, he works for something else, something older, something patient. You must understand, when the graveyard shift first emerged as a permanent institution in the 19th century, it was celebrated as progress, a way to keep the wheels of industry turning without pause, a way to make men into machines. But look deeper. Factory owners weren't just chasing profit, they were conducting experiments on the human spirit. In Manchester, in Pittsburgh, in the infernal textile mills of New England, records show workers collapsing, hallucinating, turning violent against their own kin after months of midnight labor. Doctors observed this and gave it names: night delirium, the spectral disorder. But their reports were buried, their findings dismissed, because the owners already knew the truth. Fatigue wasn't a side effect. It was the goal. A tired man does not question orders. A broken man does not dream of rebellion. A man who forgets the rhythm of the sun and the moon forgets himself. And in that forgetting, he becomes property. Even the churches, who once warned that the witching hour was a portal to evil, eventually turned silent, because tithes from industrialists and plantation magnates filled their coffers. They told the faithful that sacrifice was holy, that working through the night was godly service, when in fact it was the oldest trick in the book, taking the sacred boundary of night and turning it into a prison. Do you see it yet? The graveyard shift isn't a modern invention. It is the recycling of ancient control systems, rituals of exhaustion repackaged as progress. Look at the way hospitals still cycle nurses into 12-hour midnight rotations, the way prisons flood fluorescent light on inmates until they forget day from night, the way corporations celebrate the man who never sleeps as if he were a saint. But the cost is always the same: Broken minds, shortened lives, empty souls. This isn't just labor policy, it's ritualized sacrifice, a feeding ground disguised as employment. And the deeper you look, the more you realize the graveyard shift is not about keeping the world alive, it is about keeping you weak enough to never awaken. There is a reason they call it the graveyard shift, and it isn't poetic flair, it is a survival of language from a time when entire towns believed the night hours were stalked by forces that fed on the living. In old Europe, watchmen stood guard in cemeteries, not to protect the dead, but to make sure the dead stayed buried. Bells were tied to coffins, ropes stretched up to the surface, so that if someone was buried alive in error, their desperate ringing could be heard in the still hours before dawn. The image is chilling. An exhausted man half asleep at his post, hearing the faint cry of metal through the mist, unsure if it came from beneath the earth or from his own breaking mind. That legacy, the mingling of exhaustion, death, and madness, was fused into the night shift when it crossed the Atlantic. Colonial America inherited not only the Protestant work ethic, but also the darker knowledge that night work drained more than flesh. Early records from mining camps in Pennsylvania describe men swearing they saw shadows move against the flame of their lamps, hearing voices call their names from shafts that no one dared enter. In the cotton mills of the South, children forced to work midnight hours often reported seeing faces in the windows, pale and watching, even when the buildings stood alone on the plains. What was their answer? Not to stop the labor, but to invent new ways of binding men to the rhythm of darkness. Bells, whistles, overseers, and later, the endless hum of electricity. What began as fear was transformed into ritual, until working through the hours of the dead became normalized, celebrated even, as proof of endurance. Yet beneath that normalization, the truth never disappeared. Look into the suicide rates of night workers, the insanity diagnoses of early factory records, the bizarre accounts of mass hysteria in workhouses during the 1830s, and you will see, in a pattern too precise to be chance, something feeds in the night, and the system delivers it victims under the name of labor. They told you it was just a job, but deep down your body knows it is something else, a contract written in fatigue, signed in blood, sealed in silence. The deeper you descend into this history, the more the mask slips, and the graveyard shift reveals itself not as a quirk of industry, but as a deliberate channeling of ancient power. Think of the way empires have always used darkness to their advantage. Roman legions broke prisoners with forced night watches. Chinese dynasties punished dissidents with cycles of sleepless interrogation, and the Inquisition perfected the art of keeping heretics awake for days until their minds shattered and confessions poured out like blood. This is not coincidence. It is the recognition of a primal truth. When man is denied sleep in the hours of silence, he becomes less himself and more receptive to the voices of his masters. By the 19th century, industrial barons had rediscovered this truth, not through mysticism, but through profit. They learned that men broken by exhaustion would accept lower wages, harsher conditions, and greater chains. Governments, too, saw its utility. Prisons and asylums became laboratories of controlled insomnia, where the weak were studied like specimens, their broken minds recorded in clinical detail. Soldiers on overnight guard rotations returned haunted, more obedient, less likely to rebel. Even hospitals, those supposed sanctuaries of healing, became part of the ritual, forcing their caregivers into cycles of fatigue so brutal that mistakes and deaths mounted, and yet the system never changed. Why? Because a workforce kept in exhaustion is a workforce kept in check. And still, something older watches. The very hours between midnight and 3 were called the devil's interval in medieval Europe, the time when prayer was most desperate, when visions came unbidden, when the mind opened to what lurks just beyond the veil. Today we flood those hours with fluorescent light, coffee, and endless distraction, pretending the night is conquered, but it is not. the grave. A yard shift is still a ritual sacrifice, still a theft of the human soul, still a slow-motion execution dressed in the language of productivity. The worker thinks he is earning a living. In truth, he is feeding a machine older than any factory, older than any empire, a machine that was built to keep men from ever remembering who they truly are. By the time the 20th century dawned, the graveyard shift had woven itself so tightly into modern life that few even questioned it anymore. And that was the ultimate victory of those who engineered it, normalization of the unnatural. Factories ran without pause, hospitals expanded into 24-hour operations, and entire cities began to glow like artificial suns against the night sky, erasing the natural rhythm of darkness and replacing it with perpetual labor. But hidden beneath this march of progress were the silent casualties, night workers who aged before their time, who succumbed to heart failure, cancer, and madness at rates far beyond their daylight counterparts. Doctors whispered of shift work disorder, but the phrase was a smokescreen, a polite name for something closer to ritualized decay. Military researchers in the 1940s secretly studied night laborers, documenting hallucinations, paranoia, and sudden violence as if they were measuring the edge of sanity itself. None of it was used to protect workers. It was used to refine methods of control. The Cold War only deepened this experimentation. Insomnia became a weapon, sleep deprivation a tool of interrogation, and the graveyard shift itself a kind of mass conditioning experiment that nobody opted into, but everyone obeyed. Look closer at the blueprints of your cities, highways, factories, shipping yards, all designed to run under floodlights while the rest of the world sleeps, because the machine must never stop feeding. And in this endless cycle, the worker becomes both the offering and the fuel. Have you noticed how the night shift transforms people? How they grow hollow-eyed, disconnected, as though part of their soul has been siphoned away? That is not simply exhaustion. It is the residue of something older using them as vessels. For centuries, men spoke of demons that could only enter through the sea, racks of sleeplessness, through minds weakened in the small hours. Now science calls it psychosis, corporations call it productivity, and governments call it necessity. But all are names for the same truth. The graveyard shift is the inheritance of a pact made long ago when rulers discovered they could break a man not with chains, but with sleepless obedience. And every time you see those lights burning past midnight, every time you hear the hum of machines in the hours of the dead, you are witnessing that pact renewed, an empire of exhaustion feeding on human souls, one shift at a time. But to truly understand the sinister weight of the graveyard shift, you must go further back, before the mills, before the prisons, before the neon glow of cities, and look at the rituals that ancient cultures guarded in silence. The Babylonians carved warnings into stone tablets about the hours when gods demand watchfulness, claiming that if men slept through these intervals, they would be spared torment. But if they were forced to wake, they became vessels for shadow beings. The Egyptians believed that Ra's voyage through the underworld left the world vulnerable to possession between midnight and dawn, and so the pharaoh's guards were compelled to stand watch, not to protect the king from men, but from the unseen. Even the early Hebrews wrote of the terrors of the night in their psalms, not as poetry, but as coded recognition that certain hours should never be labored in without consequence. And yet, as empires rose, they learned that forcing the weak to occupy those forbidden hours granted power to the rulers, because broken men became docile, and the shadows that fed on them seemed to spare the masters who orchestrated it. This is the unspoken truth. The graveyard shift is not just exploitation, it is collaboration. Every sleepless body chained to midnight labor is an offering laid at the feet of something older than industry, something that governments and religions have quietly known, quietly served, and quietly feared. Why else would cathedrals across Europe ring their bells at 3 in the morning, the very heart of the witching hour. They claimed it was to drive away evil spirits, but perhaps it was to signal that the sacrifices had already been made. Why else would prisons and hospitals expand their operations precisely at the hours when human bodies are most vulnerable? They claim it is necessity, yet necessity always seems to benefit the system, never the ma. And when you walk through a city at 2 a.m., when the streets are nearly empty, but the lights blaze on in towers and factories, understand that you are looking at altars disguised as architecture. These glowing monoliths are not monuments of progress. They are shrines feeding an ancient hunger, built on the broken bodies of men who were told it was simply their job. The alliance was not accidental. It was orchestrated with precision, as if three great powers, church, state, and industry, knew that only by merging their influence could they transform a curse into common practice. The church provided the moral camouflage, preaching that toil through the night was holy sacrifice, sanctifying exhaustion as proof of faith, even though their own scriptures warned against the dangers of the midnight hours. The state gave it the authority of law, drafting statutes that demanded round-the-clock guard duty, military watches, and eventually industrial regulations that enshrined the 24-hour cycle as a civic duty. And industry provided the machinery, the endless furnaces, the factory sirens that demanded flesh to keep them alive. Each of these powers benefited while the laborer crumbled, his body hollowed, his mind frayed, his soul quietly surrendered to the silence between ticking seconds. Do you see the brilliance of it? They took something every ancient culture had feared, repackaged it as virtue, and fed it back to the masses as destiny. And once men believed it was noble to work while their families slept, once they believed it was righteous to deny the natural order of night and day, the system had won. For the exhausted man will not rise in rebellion. The sleepless man cannot dream of freedom. The broken man is the perfect subject. Hospitals still train their healers by stripping them of rest until they collapse, claiming it teaches endurance when in truth it ensures compliance. Military academies still break recruits by robbing them of sleep, saying it builds discipline when in reality it dismantles resistance. Corporations still glorify the man who grinds all night, dangling the illusion of success while harvesting his health and spirit. And above them all, the church still murmurs blessings over this cycle, its silence louder than any sermon, its complicity bought long ago. The graveyard shift became a covenant, written not in ink, but in fatigue, binding entire nations to an altar of exhaustion. And behind that altar, something waits, something that feeds not on blood spilled in battle, but on the slow starvation of souls denied rest. They turned night into a prison, and men into offerings, and they called it progress. Modern science, though draped in the language of neutrality, cannot fully conceal the horror it has uncovered about the graveyard shift. And yet, notice how carefully it buries the revelations under sterile terms and statistical reports, as if to numb the mind before it can recognize the pattern. Study after study admits that night workers suffer dramatically higher rates of cancer, heart disease, depression, and early death. But instead of declaring the practice a poison to human existence, they call it circadian disruption, or shift work disorder, as though the words themselves were designed to anesthetize the truth. Clinical journals reveal that men who labor past midnight experience changes in brain chemistry eerily similar to psychosis, that their immune systems begin to cannibalize themselves, that their hormonal cycles resemble those of the terminally ill. But the findings are tucked into footnotes, spun as manageable risks, hidden beneath recommendations to improve lighting conditions, or practice good sleep hygiene, as though a scented pillow could undo centuries of ritualized sacrifice. Do you not see it? They know. The institutions of medicine, funded by governments and corporations, acknowledge the devastation, yet never call for an end, because the graveyard shift is too valuable, too profitable, too ancient a ritual to be discarded. The very same studies that admit its dangers are also used by militaries to refine interrogation methods, by corporations to design caffeine marketing strategies, by tech giants to manipulate digital addiction into the late hours. What masquerades as care is nothing more than refinement of control. And the scientists themselves, many of them working endless nights in fluorescent labs, become both the observers and the offerings, their findings written with trembling hands, their eyes sunken from the very curse they are documenting. Ask yourself this: if science has proven beyond doubt that sleeplessness destroys the body and corrodes the mind, why has no society abolished the graveyard shift? Why do governments not outlaw it? Why do churches not condemn it? Why do corporations expand it? Because beneath the charts and percentages lies a truth they dare not print: that the destruction is the point, that the broken worker is the desired outcome, that what feeds in the dark grows stronger each time a man staggers through another night believing he has no choice. The buried truth is that what science now measures in sterile graphs is only the echo of something far older, something civilizations once spoke of openly in myths and warnings, but which today is hidden behind the facade of productivity. Ancient hunger has never vanished. It has only been given new vessels, and the graveyard shift is its perfect disguise. Look across cultures and you find the same shadow wearing different masks. The Mesopotamians spoke of the Lilu demons who crept into men's minds as they labored sleepless through the night, draining vitality with every breath. The Greeks warned of the Keres, dark spirits that swarmed battlefields after dusk, feeding on the half-dead who could not rest. In Norse sagas, the Draugr, restless dead, haunted watchmen on the midnight posts until their sanity cracked. Always the pattern is the same: men forced to keep watch when the world sleeps are not guarding against intrusion. They are the offerings. And though modern man believes he has outgrown myth, he still kneels before the same altar, only now it is lit with halogen lamps and humming machinery. The sleepless worker in a factory, the night nurse in a fluorescent corridor, the guard pacing the prison tiers at 3 a.m. Each is repeating a ritual written thousands of years ago, binding their life force to powers they cannot see, but which their bodies recognize in every cell of fatigue, every hallucination, every creeping despair. Why else would the most powerful institutions fight so viciously to normalize night labor, even when evidence shows it destroys the very workers they depend upon? Because the destruction is not collateral damage, it is the harvest. Every hour of exhaustion is a tithe paid in silence. Every shattered circadian rhythm, another rope-tying man to the invisible yoke. This is why the graveyard shift persists across every civilization, why empires call but the night watch remains, why industries rise and fall, but the sleepless cycle never dies. It is not an economic necessity, not a cultural accident. It is the continuation of an ancient pact, one your ancestors feared and your masters conceal, one that demands men as sacrifices not through war or ritual slaughter, but through the quiet, endless hours when they are too tired to fight, too broken to dream, too drained to even realize they are being fed upon. Look at the institutions of today, and you will see the fingerprints of this weaponized sleeplessness everywhere, polished and branded as progress, yet carrying the same ancient purpose: to break men in the quiet hours and remake them into obedient vessels. The military has perfected it. Every soldier, every recruit knows the cruelty of forced night watches, the exhaustion drills, the endless marches until the stars blur into a black fog. They call it training, but it is conditioning, stripping away individuality until only reflex and obedience remain. Corporations follow the same blueprint, glorifying the hustle culture, turning night labor into a badge of honor, selling young men the illusion that burning themselves down will make them powerful, when in truth it hollows them into shells who cannot think beyond quotas and deadlines. Hospitals, the very institutions meant to heal, deliberately grind their doctors and nurses with overnight rotations, ensuring that those who care for the dying are half dead themselves, too tired to rebel, too weary to notice the system that drains them. And then there is the digital empire, the newest priesthood of exhaustion. Platforms designed to keep you awake at 3 in the morning, glowing screens pulling you deeper, algorithms whispering to your dopamine-starved brain. They have built a virtual graveyard shift where you are not even paid. You are the product, your sleepless hours mined for data and profit while your spirit leaks into the void. And always, the same justification repeats. It is necessary, it is noble, it is progress. But ask yourself, progress for whom? For the soldier who forgets his own will? For the worker whose body collapses before middle age? For the nurse who watches patients die while she herself is half-conscious? Or is it progress for the powers who harvest compliance, who profit from disease, who fatten, themselves on your brokenness? Do not mistake this for coincidence. The military, the corporations, the hospitals, the tech giants, all orbit the same truth. Control the night, and you control the man. Strip his sleep, and you strip his soul. Give him no rest, and he will give you everything. That is why the graveyard shift survives. It is the silent leash, the invisible chain, the ritual sacrifice repeated in every age with new disguises but the same outcome. A world where men are too tired to fight, too weary to awaken, too broken to be free. The psychological dimension is where the graveyard shift reveals its most insidious power, for it does not only weaken the body, it rewires the mind, quietly erasing identity until the man who began the shift is no longer the one who stumbles out at dawn. Sleep is not simply rest. It is the crucible in which memory consolidates, emotion resets, and the self reassembles. To rob a man of it, night after night, is to dismantle his inner architecture piece by piece. First comes the irritability, the short temper, the snapping at those he loves. But soon after, subtler fractures appear. Decision-making falters, moral judgment blurs, paranoia creeps in like fog. And once the mind is softened by fatigue, suggestion flows in effortlessly, like water finding cracks in stone. This is why interrogators have always relied on sleep deprivation. It is not about pain. It is about erasing the boundary between self and command until the victim cannot tell his own thoughts from the words being spoken to him. Now imagine that same mechanism applied not to a prisoner, but to an entire class of men, workers, soldiers, caretakers, drained in the hours of the dead until they cannot distinguish their will from the system's demands. The graveyard shift does not only steal sleep, it steals sovereignty. It creates a man who cannot dream, and without dreams there can be no rebellion, no vision of a life beyond servitude. Even worse, prolonged exposure corrodes memory itself, leaving men with fragmented recollections, a sense that days blur together into an endless fog. What better way to rule than to trap your subjects in a state where past and future vanish, and all that remains is the endless present of labor? The mind in this condition begins to betray itself. Hallucinations creep in, whispers echo in empty rooms, shadows seem to move at the edge of vision. Science calls these symptoms of exhaustion, but ancient wisdom called them what they are: openings, fractures in the veil of the mind through which other forces may enter. This is why the graveyard shift was always feared, not merely because men grew tired, but because men who lingered too long in the sleepless dark returned changed, haunted, less than themselves. It is not just a shift of hours, it is a shift of identity, a slow possession, a theft of the self written into the schedule of labor. Possession, that is the word ancient cultures dared to speak aloud, and the one modern science skirts around with clinical euphemisms, pretending not to notice that its data points align perfectly with what shamans, priests, and mystics warned for millennia. When the human mind is kept awake in the forbidden hours, its defenses weaken, the natural rhythm that shields the psyche falters, and something else slips in. The ancients said these were spirits of the restless dead, demons of hunger, or shadow beings that required mortal vessels. Today, scientists describe them as hallucinations, intrusive thoughts, or episodes of derealization. But look closely. Are these not the same phenomena with different names? The night worker who swears he hears voices calling his name in an empty corridor is dismissed as overtired. The nurse who sees figures standing at the end of a ward that vanish when approached is diagnosed with sleep paralysis. The guard who feels watched, who feels his will bending under pressure he cannot name, is told it is stress. Yet the descriptions mirror accounts etched into stone thousands of years ago. Men on watch hearing whispers from the dark, women laboring by firelight seeing shapes that should not be there, warriors held awake for days before battle claiming visions of gods that demanded obedience. The overlap is too precise to dismiss. What if sleeplessness does not simply create illusions? What if it opens a gate? What if the graveyard shift is not merely exploitation of flesh, but an invitation, an engineered breach in human consciousness through which the unseen may enter? You think this is fantasy? Then ask yourself why every empire that enforced night labor wrapped it in ritual, bells ringing at certain hours, prayers muttered at checkpoints, hymns sung to keep men awake. These were not traditions, they were wards, desperate measures to keep some town hing at bay. And now, stripped of ritual, stripped of meaning, we enter those same hours under fluorescent lights with no protection, no awareness, nothing but fatigue to shield us. Is it any wonder so many night workers speak of feeling hollow, altered, no longer themselves? They are not just tired. They are inhabited. They are vessels shaped by a system that knows exactly what it is doing, breaking down the mind so that the gates never close, so that something old, something patient, can finally have its way with the living. Yes, profit explains part of it, but profit alone cannot account for the persistence of the graveyard shift across centuries and civilizations, not when its cost in human life so consistently outweighs its efficiency. No, the reason it endures is because institutions require more than money. They require communion, and the sleepless worker is the altar upon which that communion is made. To break a man open at night to strip him of sleep is to peel back the veil between his conscious will and the silent abyss that waits beneath, making him porous, permeable, receptive to forces his waking mind would resist. Governments know this, which is why armies are baptized not in rest, but in exhaustion. Their recruits march through the dark until their bodies obey commands without thought. Corporations know this, which is why their brightest glass towers blaze through the hours when the world should sleep, harvesting not just labor, but submission, compliance, a workforce too dulled by fatigue to question the machine it feeds. Even the church knows this, though it cloaks it in ritual. The vigils, the midnight masses, the monastic watches that claim to serve God, but just as easily serve something else that feeds in the dark. These institutions do not merely tolerate the destruction the graveyard shift inflicts, they depend on it, for every sleepless soul is a conduit, every broken man a vessel, every hollow-eyed laborer another tether holding the world in a state of quiet bondage. This is why no reform truly ends it, why no revelation in science abolishes it, why even revolutions leave it intact, because behind the industries and the payrolls, behind the sermons and the statutes, the sleepless sacrifice is not incidental, it is essential. To work through the night is to participate in a ritual older than any nation, a ritual that feeds what cannot live without the slow erosion of human spirit. And so the cycle continues, draped in uniforms and lab coats, cubicles and hospital scrubs, all disguises for the same ancient truth. The graveyard shift is not merely labor, it is liturgy, and its hymns are written in the silence of the exhausted, its prayers spoken in the language of despair, its offering made in the emptiness of men who stagger through the night, unaware. They have been made priests of a faith they never chose. The city itself is the great temple of the graveyard shift, though no one dares to name it as such, for its spires of glass and steel are altars, its endless hum of engines, the chanting of choirs, its glowing windows at 3 in the morning, the votive candles of a billion sleepless worshippers. Think of how cities never go dark anymore, how the artificial suns of street lamps and neon signs banish the night sky, drowning the stars that once guided men into rest. This is not convenience, it is consecration, a deliberate rewriting of the natural order so that the cycle of sacrifice never ceases. Every factory district with its smokestacks blazing at midnight, every hospital ward where monitors beep in sterile cadence, every office tower where silhouettes still bend over keyboards long after midnight, all of these are shrines in a single, sprawling cathedral of exhaustion. Even the architecture betrays it. The grids of highways and transit lines form the veins of a living organism whose heart never stops beating, whose lifeblood is human fatigue endlessly circulated. The city feeds on its inhabitants the way an idol feeds on offerings, and in return it grants them only the illusion of progress, wealth, or safety, rewards as hollow as the promises of any cult. Notice too how silence has been eradicated. The hum of electricity, the drone of HVAC systems, the low roar of traffic. These are the perpetual hymns, the constant vibration ensuring that no soul can ever descend into the true stillness of rest. In ancient times, temples were built to house gods that demanded blood. In our time, cities are built to house the sleepless, their light and noise ensuring the sacrifice never pauses, their towers rising not to shelter us, but to signal allegiance to the unseen powers that thrive on our unending wakefulness. To walk through a city at 2 a.m. is to walk through a ritual in progress. Every glowing sign, another invocation. Every man hunched in fluorescent light, another priest unknowing. Every sigh of exhaustion, another prayer carried into the invisible. The city is not neutral. It is sacred ground, but its holiness belongs not to life, but to that hunger which grows stronger each time the night is denied its silence, each time men are denied their dreams. And for those bound within this cycle, the most devastating theft is not only their health or their labor, but their very sense of time itself. For the graveyard shift dissolves the boundaries of day and night until hours blur into a gray continuum where memory no longer anchors and the self drifts unmoored. Ask the night worker and he will tell you of days that vanish without recall, of weeks that feel like a single endless night, of mornings that arrive like an intrusion rather than a blessing. His life becomes not a sequence of events, but a smear of fatigue stretched thin across a calendar he no longer trusts. This is why so many describe a sensation of living outside the world, as though watching through glass while others move freely in daylight, tethered to rhythms he can no longer join. And it is not merely perception, it is measurable. Studies show that sleepless men misjudge time, their internal clocks running too fast or too slow, their memories failing to mark sequence or duration, their very experience of reality fragmenting. What science calls temporal distortion is nothing less than the erosion of the soul's tether to the flow of existence. And here again the ancients spoke more plainly, warning that those who wandered too long in sleeplessness were stolen by the spirits of twilight, lost in a realm where time does not flow but circles back upon itself. This is why the graveyard shift feels endless, because for those trapped in it, it is endless, not measured in days, but in an eternal recurrence of fluorescent nights, where yesterday, today, and tomorrow collapse into one unbroken vigil. The city temple thrives on this dislocation, for a man who cannot perceive time cannot resist its theft. He cannot plan revolt. He cannot remember clearly the life he once wanted. He cannot imagine a future beyond the cycle. He simply drifts, endlessly present yet absent. From himself, his time consumed not hour by hour, but in great invisible gulps, swallowed whole by the machine. And so the graveyard shift does not merely harvest labor, it harvests existence itself, turning men into shadows who still breathe but no longer live, whose days have been stolen and offered up to a hunger that grows stronger each time another life is lost to the blur. The corrosion of time within the graveyard shift does not remain confined to the worker alone, but seeps outward, infecting families, unraveling relationships, and echoing into generations yet unborn. For when a man loses his rhythm, everyone bound to him loses theirs as well. The father who staggers home at dawn cannot greet his children awake, and when they stir for school he lies collapsed in a darkened room, absent from their mornings, absent from their memories, until eventually he becomes a ghost who lives in the same house but never in the same hours. The mother who nurses through the night drifts through her days half present, her patience eroded, her warmth thinned into exhaustion, her love felt but blurred behind eyes that cannot stay open. Her children inherit not only her fatigue, but her fractured presence, learning early that the world runs on absence. Marriages collapse under this weight, not always in fiery quarrels, but in a quieter entropy, the steady erosion of intimacy when partners no longer share a bed, no longer share a meal, no longer share the rhythm of days that binds two souls together. Even friendships dissolve, for the night worker cannot keep the pace of gatherings, cannot share in sunlight hours, and so he withdraws, slowly forgotten, replaced, until isolation becomes his only company. And then the cycle deepens, for the children of such households grow accustomed to absence as normal, their concept of family bent around gaps and silences, and in turn they enter the world already half prepared to repeat the ritual of exhaustion, already shaped to give themselves to the machine without resistance. In this way, the graveyard shift reproduces itself across bloodlines, ensuring not only the breaking of one man, but the inheritance of brokenness by his descendants. What appears as an economic necessity is in truth a generational curse, a theft not only of one life, but of futures, of continuity, of the sacred rhythm that ties family to family across time. The institution that demands sleeplessness does not simply drain workers, it fractures lineage, it dismantles the household as a source of strength, ensuring that men return to their posts not as free beings with families to protect, but as hollowed units, severed from the very bonds that might one day give them courage to resist. Thus the graveyard shift does not end with the exhausted body collapsing in the morning. It continues in the tears of a wife unheard, in the loneliness of a child unseen, in the silence of a lineage unrooted, its power spreading like cracks in stone until the sacrifice multiplies far beyond the single worker, encompassing all who are bound to him. When enough men and women are bound to this broken rhythm, the fracture no longer belongs to individuals or families alone, but expands outward until whole societies take on the shape of exhaustion, becoming cultures of fatigue where disconnection is normalized and quiet submission is mistaken for civility. You see it in the eyes of commuters slumped on trains at dawn, in the blank stares of cashiers under fluorescent lights, in the strained smiles of teachers too tired to inspire, in the silence of households where conversations die before they begin because no one has the energy to sustain them. A nation deprived of sleep becomes a nation incapable of dreaming, its people too dulled to imagine alternatives, too weary to organize, too fractured to resist the machinery that devours them. Instead of communities bound by shared rituals of rest, gathering, and renewal, you find only fragments, neighbors who do not know each other, families who eat at separate hours, children raised by screens, while parents stumble through shifts. The result is a populace easy to govern, easy to distract, easy to sell illusions to, for fatigue strips away not just vitality, but discernment. Propaganda sinks deeper when the mind is fogged. Consumer goods appear more necessary when one is too tired to reflect. And political theater passes uncontested when citizens are too drained to stand in protest. Thus, the graveyard shift does not merely serve the economic hunger of industry, but becomes the foundation of social order itself, ensuring that the masses remain compliant, fractured, and pacified. In such societies, disconnection is celebrated as independence, exhaustion rebranded as productivity, and the erosion of human bonds mistaken for progress. And once this rhythm dominates an entire culture, even those not bound to night labor feel its weight, for the culture of sleeplessness seeps into every schedule, every expectation, every glowing screen that follows its citizens into bed. Soon the whole society becomes a sleepless machine, its people pacing in circles like cogs, proud of their exhaustion, blind to their bondage, unaware that they are no longer citizens of a living world, but worshippers in a sprawling temple of fatigue. Governments, of course, recognize the utility of this societal fatigue, for a weary population is far easier to command than a rested one, and so the culture of sleeplessness becomes not a byproduct of progress, but a weapon of governance, a subtle but devastating form of mass control. The exhausted citizen is predictable. He rises mechanically, works mechanically, consumes mechanically, and votes, if he votes at all, in the same haze that carries him through his days. He has no surplus of energy to question policies, no clarity of mind to see through deceit, no reserves of spirit to resist when his freedoms are chipped away one by one. And this is precisely the condition rulers desire, for rebellion does not spark in a body drained of strength, nor does vision emerge from eyes that can barely stay open. Instead of chains and prisons, they impose schedules. Instead of censures, they impose commutes. Instead of shackles, they impose deadlines. And the result is the same: a populace whose labor is extracted while their will to resist is bled dry. Propaganda thrives in this climate because the exhausted brain accepts slogans more readily than arguments. Surveillance thrives because the weary citizen lacks the focus to notice it. Bureaucracy thrives because the tired man will sign any form just to be done with it. Even war becomes easier to sustain, for men so dulled by fatigue no longer question why they are sent or what they are defending. They obey because it is easier than thinking. And so governments cultivate sleeplessness as soil in which obedience grows, all while cloaking it in the language of progress, patriotism, and necessity. They tell us we are building the future, competing in the global race, serving the greater good, when in truth we are simply being drained into compliance, our very circadian rhythms rewritten as instruments of policy. What tyrant needs whip or gallows when he can wield the clock as his weapon, when he can command not only your labor but your dreams, ensuring that even in your rest you are too broken to imagine freedom? Thus, the graveyard shift becomes the state's most perfect tool, not a punishment inflicted on the few, but a condition cultivated across the many, a nation ruled not by fear, but by fatigue, its citizens shackled not by iron, but by exhaustion. It is here, at the intersection of profit and power, that the true face of the sleepless order reveals itself, for governments and corporations do not merely coexist within this architecture of exhaustion, they collaborate, merging into a single machine where capital and authority feed upon the same lifeblood of human fatigue. The corporation demands endless productivity, the government demands endless compliance, and together they discover that sleeplessness secures both, a workforce too drained to rebel, yet too dependent to withdraw, a populace too tired to question, yet too obedient to resist. This is why policy so often bends to the needs of industry, why labor laws allow loopholes wide enough to swallow lives, why infrastructure is designed to funnel bodies into long commutes and longer shifts, why digital networks are engineered to keep us staring into light long after midnight. The state pretends to regulate the corporation pretends to serve the state, but in truth they are two hands of the same hunger, each ensuring the other's survival by feeding the endless cycle of wakefulness. The corporate tower shines its lights at 3 a.m., not only because profit demands it, but because the glowing skyline itself becomes a declaration of order, a reminder to the citizen that the machine never sleeps, and therefore neither should he. The government, in turn, sanctifies this arrangement by framing it as patriotic duty, economic necessity, global competition, weaving a mythology that convinces the weary masses that their exhaustion is noble sacrifice rather than orchestrated servitude. And so the lines between market and state dissolve, leaving behind a global system that operates with the same logic as the ancient cults. The sacrifice must never stop. The fires must always burn. The offering of human vitality must flow without end. What difference is there, true lie, between the priest demanding blood for the gods of harvest and the manager demanding overtime for the gods of profit? Between the emperor decreeing night watches to maintain his empire and the government enforcing 24-hour economies to maintain its dominance? None at all. The altar has changed its appearance, but the ritual has not. The sleepless body remains the offering, and the machine remains the deity that grows fat upon it. Its priests, a seamless alliance of CEOs and ministers. Its congregation, the masses, who stumble through the dark, believing they have chosen this life, when in truth, it has been chosen for them. What makes the global cult of sleeplessness so complete is that it has long since spread beyond the confines of labor and governance, bleeding into entertainment, technology, and culture itself, until even leisure has been captured and remade as another form of sacrifice, another mechanism to keep the body awake and the mind distracted while the offering continues. Once, rest was not simply the absence of work, but a sacred interval of renewal, a time when the soul recalibrated and the body reclaimed its strength. Now, rest has been hollowed out and replaced with screens, with endless feeds that scroll without conclusion, with shows that bleed episode into episode until dawn rises on eyes that have not closed. The machine has learned that if it cannot command you to labor through the night, it can seduce you into surrendering your hours willingly, dressing your sleeplessness as freedom, as choice, as entertainment. Streaming platforms brag about their catalogs designed to be consumed without pause. Social media companies perfect algorithms to trigger dopamine spikes at 2 in the morning. Video games construct worlds more vivid than dreams so that dreams themselves become obsolete. And the people comply eagerly, believing they are indulging in pleasure, when in truth they are participating in the same liturgy of exhaustion. Their energy bled not into factories or offices, but into the glowing devices that function as portable altars of the cult. The genius of this arrangement lies in its camouflage. The worker no longer feels forced. He feels entertained. He believes he is choosing. Yet when the sun rises, his body is just as broken, his time just as stolen, his spirit just as drained, as if he had labored under overseers. Leisure has been colonized, culture rewritten, technology weaponized so that there is no refuge left, no corner of existence not penetrated by the demand to remain awake, to remain engaged, to remain feeding the machine. Even art, once the refuge of resistance, is harnessed into this cycle, delivered in formats designed to never end, consumed in fragments that scatter attention, ensuring that no stillness remains. Thus, the sleepless order secures itself not only through law and labor, but through the very rhythms of pleasure, until a population no longer knows how to rest, no longer desires to rest, and in that loss of desire lies the deepest victory of the cult. For the perfect sacrifice is not the body forced to the altar, but the body that climbs upon it willingly, smiling as it is consumed. And so the most insidious consequence of this surrender is not only the weariness of the body or the fraying of relationships, but the slow starvation of the human imagination itself. For when the cycle of true rest is broken, the very faculty of dreaming, both the dreams of sleep and the dreams of waking, begins to wither, leaving behind a people incapable of vision. Dreams are not frivolous. They are the inner workshop of the mind where scattered fragments of memory are forged into meaning, where the impossible is rehearsed until it becomes possible, where the spirit is given images of freedom that no master can dictate. But in the sleepless order, this inner sanctuary is dismantled, its hours sold off to screens and shifts, its visions drowned in fatigue until the mind grows barren. Without rest, sleep becomes shallow, fractured, unable to descend into the deep waters where true dreaming stirs, and the rare scraps that survive are quickly forgotten upon waking, like embers smothered in ash. In the waking world, imagination withers too, for the exhausted mind cannot wander, cannot envision futures, cannot conceive alternatives. It can only cling to the immediate demands placed before it, producing not art or prophecy or rebellion, but mere compliance. Thus, the graveyard shift expands beyond industry, beyond culture, into the realm of the soul itself, stripping away the last refuge of freedom, the power to dream. And when a people cannot dream, they cannot resist, for resistance requires an image of another world, a vision of something better than what is given. Without imagination, submission becomes not only inevitable, but invisible, accepted as natural, as though no other rhythm were possible, as though no other order had ever existed. The machine has no need to chain such a people, for they are already bound by the collapse of their own vision. They have no language for or liberation, because the words for it can only be born in dream. In this way, the cult of sleeplessness does not merely devour the hours of men, it devours the future itself, ensuring that generations rise without the capacity to imagine freedom, leaving the altar safe, the fires fed, the sacrifice unending. Into this void left by the withering of authentic dreams, the machine inserts its own fabrications, artificial visions crafted not in the mystery of sleep, but in the laboratories of commerce and propaganda. Synthetic substitutes for imagination designed to keep the masses tethered while convincing them they are still capable of wonder. These artificial dreams arrive through glowing screens, through advertising campaigns, through cinematic universes and digital simulations, all calibrated to replace the lost interior life with a prefabricated one, a dream that does not emerge from the depths of the soul, but is downloaded, purchased, consumed. The people, unable to generate visions of their own, receive these images eagerly, mistaking them for inspiration, mistaking scripted fantasies for authentic longing, until the very faculty of dreaming becomes outsourced to the machinery of culture. No longer do children fall asleep imagining boundless futures of their own invention. Instead, they inherit branded myths, corporate epics, synthetic heroes that ensure their desires are aligned with the market before they can even speak them aloud. The exhausted adult, unable to dream naturally, embraces the packaged illusions of consumer goods and entertainment spectacles, believing he has chosen these fantasies when in truth they were placed in his hands because his imagination had already been stripped away. In this way, the machine not only robs but replaces, ensuring that the hunger for vision is never extinguished but perpetually redirected into channels that benefit its continuity. Even rebellion is simulated, commodified, turned into a product to be purchased rather than a fire to be lived, so that the people are allowed to feel radical without ever threatening the altar. And the genius of this system is that its artificial dreams are endless, always updated, always expanding, promising meaning while delivering only distraction, ensuring that no one ever notices the absence of true vision. Thus humanity, starved of real dreaming, comes to accept counterfeit dreaming as sufficient. And in that acceptance, the machine secures its deepest victory, for it no longer merely controls the body or the hours, but the very architecture of desire itself, planting its visions where once the soul planted its own, ensuring that even in our sleep we dream not of freedom, but of the next offering. Once these artificial dreams take root, they do not remain harmless diversions, but evolve into full instruments of worship, turning entire populations into celebrants of the sleepless cult, who no longer perceive themselves as victims of exhaustion, but as participants in a grand liturgy of progress, success, and spectacle. The corporate mythologies, fed through screens and billboards, are recited like prayers, their slogans internalized until men and women repeat them unconsciously as guiding truths, aligning their desires with the machinery that drains them. The cinematic universes, digital platforms, and branded identities do not merely entertain. They function as sacred texts of the new religion, offering meaning, purpose, and belonging in place of the inner dreams that have been stripped away. Workers who once might have questioned the endless churn of their labor now see themselves reflected in these manufactured epics, imagining that their fatigue is heroic, their struggle noble, their sacrifices part of a larger narrative orchestrated by gods of technology and growth. The altar of sleeplessness thus becomes invisible, hidden beneath the glitter of spectacle, for the people kneel willingly, singing the hymns of advertising jingles, wearing the vestments of corporate logos, carrying their glowing icons in their pockets like relics. Even exhaustion is romanticized, rebranded as hustle, as ambition, as dedication to a destiny greater than the self, so that the very suffering once recognized as a curse becomes embraced as a badge of honor. In this way, the cult achieves the perfection of its ritual, a congregation that not only accepts its fatigue but celebrates it, that not only consumes its artificial dreams but evangelizes them, spreading the doctrine of sleeplessness across every border until the entire globe hums with the same ceaseless rhythm. What began as labor, too, transformed into ritual. What began as sacrifice became worship, and now the machine no longer has to demand allegiance, for allegiance flows freely, offered up in song, in purchase, in devotion, in sleepless nights, mistaken for glory. The cult has no need of priests anymore, because the people themselves have become its priests, carrying the liturgy in their hearts and preaching it with their very exhaustion, ensuring that the offering never ends, the altar never cools, the fire never dies. The worship of the sleepless cult ultimately converges on a single promise, the lure of false immortality, for while the bodies of its servants crumble under fatigue, the machine itself projects an aura of permanence, a claim that, unlike flesh, it will never falter, never sleep, never die. Every illuminated skyline, every humming server farm, every 24-hour market proclaims this same illusion, that the system is eternal, that its rhythm outlasts generations, that to serve it is to participate in something greater than mortality. The weary citizen, stripped of authentic dreams and fed only with manufactured visions, comes to believe that his exhaustion is not waste but investment, that the hours he surrenders are absorbed into the body of the machine which will outlive him, carrying his sacrifice forward as though it were a kind of afterlife. Corporations promise legacy through brands that will never die. Governments promise security through structures that will never fall. Technologies promise continuity through data that will never be erased. And in all of these assurances lies the same seduction. You may perish, but the machine endures, and therefore your sleeplessness was not in vain. Yet this immortality is counterfeit, for the machine endures only by devouring the vitality of the living, its eternity purchased through the constant consumption of mortal hours, mortal energy, mortal blood. It has no soul, no memory, no compassion, only momentum, the ceaseless churn of systems that must be fed or collapse. But the people, too tired to discern the lie, cling to it desperately. For what else can comfort them in a world where their own lives are reduced to fragments of labor and entertainment? They chant the slogans of legacy. They believe in the gospel of innovation. They bow before the shining temples of glass and steel, all convinced that by keeping the machine alive they will be remembered, that some part of them will be preserved in the sleepless continuity of progress. Yet in truth, They vanish silently, one by one, while the machine replaces them without pause, caring nothing for their sacrifice beyond the fact that it sustains the illusion of permanence. This is the ultimate deception of the cult, that it convinces its victims to celebrate their own erasure, to believe that by feeding the altar they achieve immortality, when in fact only the altar survives, glowing in the night, indifferent to the ashes of those who once kept its fire alive. Yet even within the blinding glare of this false immortality, cracks inevitably appear, for no machine, however vast, can entirely conceal the weight of its own fragility. And in those rare moments when its rhythm stutters, when the lights flicker, when the network fails, when the market collapses, the illusion of eternity is momentarily shattered, revealing the raw machinery beneath, fragile and dependent, vulnerable and mortal. These interruptions, though often brief, expose truths that propaganda cannot fully smother, that the sleepless cult depends utterly on the sacrifices of the living, that without the endless flow of labor, attention, and compliance, the system stalls and falters like a beast deprived of blood. The power outage, the strike, the server crash, the financial panic. Each of these ruptures whispers a forbidden message into the exhausted imagination of the people, reminding them that the machine is not divine but parasitic, not immortal but precarious, and that if the sacrifice ceased, even for a moment, its permanence would dissolve like smoke. And though the cult responds with redoubled force, repairing, rebranding, reassuring, demanding greater vigilance against the threat of collapse, some residue of recognition lingers in the minds of those who witnessed the interruption, a flicker of understanding that perhaps their sleeplessness is not inevitable, perhaps the altar can be abandoned, perhaps another rhythm is still possible. It is in these fractures that resistance is born, not from grand revelations, but from tiny glimpses of the machine's weakness, moments when its great promise of eternity is exposed as a lie, sustained only by their own weary compliance. And though fatigue often buries these insights beneath layers of resignation, they do not vanish entirely. They lie dormant, smoldering like embers in the minds of the restless, waiting for breath enough to ignite into flame. For if the people were ever to awaken fully to the fragility of the cult, to recognize that the fire of the altar burns only so long as they feed it, the illusion of immortality would collapse in an instant, and the sleepless machine would be revealed for what it has always been, not a god, not a destiny, but a hunger that cannot survive without its prey. From these scattered fractures there emerges, slowly and almost imperceptibly at first, a pattern of recognition, as if the faint sparks glimpsed in moments of collapse begin to drift toward one another, gathering into constellations of awareness that signal the possibility of collective resistance. A worker who has endured one blackout too many starts to question the supposed permanence of the system. A community left stranded during a network failure begins to improvise alternatives. A generation raised on artificial dreams starts to notice the emptiness behind the spectacle, their hunger for authenticity no longer satisfied by endless consumption. Though these realizations often remain buried beneath exhaustion, they nonetheless resonate, traveling silently across conversations, gestures, and shared silences, forming an invisible current of discontent. The machine, sensing this subterranean shift, works tirelessly to disguise it, offering new distractions, new narratives, new artificial dreams. But the cracks cannot be wholly sealed, for once the illusion of immortality is pierced, no repair can fully restore its sanctity. Thus, the beginnings of resistance emerge not in grand revolutions, but in subtle refusals. The decision to turn off the glowing screen for a night, the refusal of an extra shift despite the penalty, the gathering of neighbors who find joy in one another's company instead of mediated distraction, the fragile act of closing one's eyes and reclaiming sleep as a sacred rebellion. Each of these acts, though small, weakens the altar, for the sleepless machine thrives only on unbroken obedience. And when the flow of sacrifice is interrupted even briefly, its hunger is revealed for what it is: desperate, insatiable, dependent. The cult fears these refusals more than any riot or declaration, for they represent the reawakening of an interior life, the restorate, ion of dreaming, the return of imagination that cannot be purchased or dictated. And though the people may not yet see themselves as a movement, though they may still believe their refusals are isolated, the machine trembles, for it knows what they do not. That every fracture, every spark, every quiet act of resistance is already part of a larger pattern, and once enough of these constellations connect, the illusion of eternity will collapse under the weight of a truth too powerful to suppress. That the sleepless order survives only because the people have forgotten they have the power to stop feeding it. Sensing the growing tremors within its foundation, the machine responds with predictable violence, tightening its grip in every direction, for nothing terrifies it more than the prospect of people remembering their own power. And so it multiplies distractions, accelerates propaganda, and sharpens its punishments into instruments of fear. The cult of sleeplessness begins to dress its demands in harsher garments. Overtime becomes mandatory under the banner of patriotism. Connectivity is framed as civic duty. Exhaustion itself is reframed as proof of loyalty to the cause of progress, while those who resist are labeled selfish, unproductive, even dangerous. Surveillance deepens, not only through cameras and algorithms, but through the more intimate policing of culture, where peers are taught to shame one another for resting, where the language of ambition and hustle becomes the new catechism, where failure to sacrifice is seen as betrayal. At the same time, the machine deploys new spectacles to drown out dissent, offering ever more dazzling artificial dreams to seduce the imagination back into captivity, so that even suspicion of the system is quickly pacified with a flood of entertainment, novelty, and distraction. And yet beneath this tightening control lies the unmistakable scent of panic, for the cult understands that violence, however efficient, cannot forever extinguish the embers of resistance. It can only scatter them, sometimes in ways that ignite new fires. Every crackdown exposes the fear of the altar itself, reminding the people that the machine is not divine, but anxious, not eternal, but threatened, and in this unintended revelation, its authority weakens further. For when power must constantly shout to maintain obedience, its silence has already been broken. When the cult must double its demands, it reveals that obedience is no longer secure. When sleeplessness must be enforced at the point of fear, the first seeds of liberation are already taking root in the cracks it cannot close. Thus the machine, in tightening its grip, unwittingly accelerates its own unraveling, for no empire of exhaustion can endure forever against the slow and stubborn return of human dreaming. Out of the scattered refusals and the unspoken recognition of the machine's fragility, a new language begins to take shape, hesitant at first, whispered in quiet gatherings and half-forgotten corners, but gaining strength as it passes from voice to voice, becoming a vocabulary of rebellion that dares to name what the cult has labored so tirelessly to obscure. This language is not given by the machine, but born from lived exhaustion, from the aching bodies that refuse to be glamorized as productivity, from the restless minds that reclaim their right to dream, from the small acts of defiance that reveal themselves to be common rather than isolated. It is a language that remembers what was stolen, the dignity of rest, the sanctity of silence, the beauty of unmeasured time, and in speaking these truths aloud it restores to the people a vision of freedom that no artificial dream can counterfeit. The more it is spoken, the more it spreads, weaving disparate struggles into a tapestry of shared recognition, teaching the weary that their suffering is not individual failure but collective theft, not natural law but imposed ritual. And because the cult has long depended on silence, on each believer imagining themselves alone in their fatigue, this newfound speech is as subversive as fire. For once people can name their condition, they can also imagine its end. The slogans of ambition, once repeated like prayers, lose their glamour when set beside words of liberation. The idols of productivity topple when compared to visions of joy unbound by labor. The altar itself begins to tremble when the people discover that in their dreams lies a vocabulary older, and more enduring than any machine. This language does not rise in manifestos alone, but in songs, in stories, in gestures of solidarity, in the quiet power of naming what was hidden, and with every utterance it chips away at the ilu, scion of immortality, reminding the world that the cult is neither eternal nor necessary. Thus, rebellion does not begin with weapons or riots, but with words, words that gather the scattered embers into flame, words that recall a rhythm deeper than sleeplessness, words that transform exhaustion into the first breath of freedom. As this language of rebellion spreads, it begins to do more than merely name the hidden wound. It generates an alternative rhythm, a collective pulse that rises in direct opposition to the sleepless cult, a counter-order of time that refuses the tyranny of endless acceleration. At first it is fragile, manifesting in small, communal pauses, in gatherings where work is momentarily suspended, and people allow themselves to sit, to eat, to laugh without purpose or measurement, rediscovering a tempo that does not demand sacrifice, but nurtures restoration. Soon, these pauses synchronize, their frequency increasing as more communities embrace them, until what began as isolated refusals grows into an emergent rhythm of resistance, one that honors cycles of rest, darkness, dreaming, and silence as sacred rather than wasteful. Unlike the machine's sterile continuity, this rhythm breathes, expands and contracts, acknowledges limitation as part of life rather than something to be conquered. It does not glorify exhaustion, but celebrates renewal, recognizing that true power lies not in perpetual expenditure, but in the capacity to stop, to recover, to dream anew. The more people live within this alternative order, the more the cult's grip loosens, for its rituals rely entirely on the obliteration of such cycles. When rest is reclaimed as communal joy, when dreaming is shared as prophecy rather than escapism, the altar begins to starve. Even the body, long enslaved to the demands of sleepless labor, remembers its natural cadences, its hunger for rhythm and balance, and in doing so becomes itself an instrument of rebellion, declaring through its restoration that another way of being is not only imaginable but already underway. And so the language of resistance, once whispered, becomes incarnate in time itself, a collective heartbeat rising against the endless hum of the machine, declaring not only what is wrong but what is possible, a world in which time belongs not to the altar of sleeplessness but to the living who refuse to be consumed by it. Threatened by the rise of this alternative rhythm, the machine seeks to counterfeit it, fabricating hollow imitations of rest and freedom that can be consumed without ever truly liberating the body or the imagination, for it knows that if people fully surrender to the authentic cycles of pause and dreaming, its altar will be deprived of sacrifice. Thus, it manufactures vacations that are saturated with advertisement and obligation, leisure that is commodified into purchases and performances, sleep reduced to a quantified metric optimized for productivity rather than renewal, and even rebellion packaged into consumable trends that pose no real threat to the cult's order. It invents festivals that mimic celebration but are tethered to commerce, retreats that promise healing but return the exhausted to labor with greater compliance, entertainment that masquerades as freedom but keeps the mind tethered to glowing screens. By doing so, the machine hopes to smother the genuine rhythm of resistance beneath layers of counterfeit rest, so that even the longing for liberation is redirected back into consumption, reabsorbed into the endless churn. And yet, for all its clever disguises, these imitations never fully satisfy, for the body knows the difference between genuine renewal and the shallow parody of rest, and the imagination hungers for dreams that cannot be purchased. Over time, these false rhythms begin to unravel, their emptiness exposed in the gnawing fatigue that persists despite every product and program, their fraud revealed in the deep yearning that still rises in the quiet moments when the machine's noise briefly recedes. In this failure, the people discover another truth, that liberation cannot be manufactured or sold, that authentic freedom is not a commodity but a practice of reclaiming time, of rediscovering the cycles buried beneath sleeplessness. And so, the sea, counterfeit gifts of the machine, intended to pacify, inadvertently sharpen the hunger for the real, driving more and more toward the rhythms of resistance that no altar can imitate, no propaganda can disguise, no machine can endure. As the hunger for what is real intensifies, the authentic rhythm begins to outgrow the fragile secrecy of whispers and gestures, manifesting now in the life of whole communities that openly defy the sleepless cult, choosing to live by a different order of time even under the watchful eyes of the machine. Villages and neighborhoods begin to structure themselves around shared cycles of work and rest that refuse the altar's demand for endless labor. Families close their doors to glowing screens after dusk and reclaim the night for storytelling, music, and dreaming. And groups of workers organize not simply to bargain for wages, but to reclaim time itself as a collective treasure. These communities become living testaments that another world is possible, their cadence a steady refusal to be consumed, and in their gatherings a profound joy emerges, an unmeasured, unprofitable joy that the machine cannot replicate, for it is born not of consumption, but of presence, not of sleepless striving, but of rest that deepens into creativity and communion. The cult, unable to stamp out every pocket of resistance, redoubles its efforts to isolate and shame them, branding such communities as lazy, primitive, inefficient, even dangerous to progress. Yet the more it condemns them, the more their example spreads, for others, weary of counterfeit freedom, see in them a glimmer of what they too desire. Soon the rhythm of rebellion becomes not a hidden undercurrent, but a visible alternative, a counterculture of time that inspires courage in those who had believed themselves powerless, showing that the altar's grip can indeed be broken. And though the machine still towers over the earth with its humming servers, its glowing towers, its sleepless markets, it can no longer claim eternity, for before its very eyes, whole societies are remembering the forgotten truth that time belongs to the living, that dreams cannot be purchased, and that a people who reclaim the night for rest and the day for joy are already freer than any cult of sleeplessness dares to imagine. Confronted with the spectacle of entire communities living beyond its reach, the machine grows restless and unstable, for its cult of sleeplessness has always depended on the illusion of total obedience, and every pocket of defiance exposes the possibility of a world without it. At first it seeks to intensify its control, flooding the rebellious zones with surveillance, disinformation, and economic punishments. But the more it presses, the more it reveals its desperation, and cracks begin to appear within its own body. The endless circuits that once seemed unshakable strain under the pressure of sustaining constant growth. Its markets stutter with volatility as more people withdraw from consumption, and its servers, burdened by ceaseless data, begin to falter with irregular interruptions that spread unease through the faithful. Within the machine's hierarchy, factions emerge, some urging harsher measures of control, others whispering that adaptation may be necessary. Yet in their disputes lies the proof that the altar's confidence has already fractured. Workers within its core, once its most loyal servants, begin to glimpse the futility of their endless toil, for even they are not immune to the exhaustion and emptiness that its counterfeit freedoms cannot soothe. Rumors spread that the system is weaker than it appears, that the facade of invincibility conceals a machinery running far closer to collapse than the cult dares admit, and these murmurs travel outward, emboldening those already inclined toward resistance. For the first time in its reign, the machine begins to fear not only external rebellion, but internal disintegration, a slow unraveling born from the very sleeplessness it enforced upon all. Its own hunger has grown so vast, so insatiable, that it now consumes its strength as well as its victims, and the altar, once radiant with false eternity, flickers with the unmistakable signs of mortality. Sensing the instability of the machine and emboldened by the faltering of its once terrifying grip, the people begin to step beyond secrecy and hesitation, organizing more boldly, transforming scattered resistance into open defiance that no longer hides in shadows, but confronts the altar in daylight. What was once whispered in quiet corners now roars through assemblies, marketplaces, and streets, as workers, families, and dreamers gather not merely to endure, but to declare openly their refusal to be consumed. Strikes emerge that are not only against wages, but against the very logic of sleeplessness, collective pauses that bring entire industries to silence, proving that the flow of sacrifice can be interrupted on a scale the cult had long considered impossible. Communities march together, not demanding more efficient exploitation, but insisting on their right to rest, to joy, to unmeasured time, reclaiming language once twisted into slogans of ambition and turning it into cries for liberation. Even the young, who had been raised on artificial dreams, now take to the streets with banners and songs that envision futures unbound by the machine's demands, their voices echoing with a conviction that terrifies those still loyal to the altar. Though the machine responds with predictable violence, deploying its enforcers, tightening surveillance, smearing the rebels as enemies of progress, the old terror no longer works as it once did, for the people have tasted another rhythm and seen in their defiance a power greater than fear. And with each act of open rebellion, with each refusal to sacrifice their nights, their bodies, their dreams, the illusion of the altar's immortality crumbles further, revealing the machine not as a god, but as a fragile construct, vast yet vulnerable, incapable of surviving a world that has remembered its own power to dream and rest.